Welcome back to Highly Respected. I'm your host, Scott Greer. We've got a terrific, a superb show. I mean, some people are even using that word to describe the episode we have for you today. Got a lot of topics to talk about. Last week, I, of course, said we're going to discuss the census. That is going to be one of the topics we're going to discuss today. But first, I want to talk. And we've got also, before we begin into the show, we have a main topic. It is not the census because there's something else I need to talk at length, but we will get to that topic. That will be the last topic before we hit the cognitive elite question. But the first topic to talk about, just for a little bit, I mean, last week I did a whole episode about the Afghanistan withdrawal. I think I talked about it for an hour and 10 minutes before we got to the cognitive elite questions, just thinking about how much we talked about it. But there's been so much to happen that I have to discuss a little bit of how the Afghanistan situation is playing out. So everyone Biden is definitely taking a major political loss through the Afghanistan pullout. Even if you're looking at polls, majority of Americans are saying it's going poorly. If I looked at the last one, it's over 60%. Only roughly 30%, I think it might even be less than 30%, think it's going well. And it is not going well for Biden at all. And everyone from left and right is criticizing him. The media has gone full on pro-war stance, anti-withdrawal, and, really hitting Biden in a way that we have never seen before. The media's been in the bag for Biden ever since he secured the Democratic nomination. They provided cover for him when he had sexual assault allegations made against him last year. They always ignored the Hunter Biden allegations. They always played defense for him, and they've treated him as like a godsend ever since he was inaugurated. They've talked about how he's the greatest president ever, but now they are excoriating him. They're getting very mad. They are piping mad about Biden's withdrawal, and they are not, they're not holding any punches back. And if you watch any of the cable news, especially the nightly news, on CNN, of course, Fox News, MSNBC, they are pretty much all critical with a few exceptions. But I still stand by my point, even though you're seeing all the polls and the media backlash against Biden, I don't think this is going to have the pullout itself is not going to have as much long-term consequences, at least till 2022. We could have a terror attack by 2024, but as I said on the last podcast, our system is not built to care about Islamic terrorism anymore. They would find a reason to blame white people for it, or to say, oh, they killed hundreds of people, but it's worse, January 6th. And so it doesn't matter what, I don't know necessarily if that would wake people up and use it as a political issue. What's really going to happen is the Afghan refugee situation, which surprisingly, Biden is showing more common sense on this than most Republicans. And some people have attacked me for being pro-Biden and wanting to say, praise him for doing a good job. I'm not necessarily praising him. I'm just, offering an objective take where I see it how it is. And I see all these Republicans going full neocon mode, not just with foreign policy, but also with immigration policy, just to score cheap political points against Biden. It's stupid. All these people are coming out and demanding that we have a moral obligation to take in refugees. They're, demanding that we should have set these conditions to leave, and we should have kept these people there, and we should have kept Bagram Air Base, and yada, yada, yada. And it's all excuses just to keep us there forever. And you're even seeing a lot of Republicans now saying, well, I guess the cost of keeping 3,000 or 5,000 troops there forever was a good enough cost to take out these anti-women, anti-gay Taliban and keep them from taking power. And think about our poor little allies that are running away. Oh, we need to do so much for them. Yeah, that's now the Republican stance. And they're all begging for these refugees, from people like Georgia Governor Brian Kemp, who's like, oh, we need them. Arizona Governor Doug Ducey. All these people are begging for refugees. And you see Biden and some of these Republican senators, they're wanting to pass legislation or calling on Biden to bypass bureaucracy, crush the red tape, and accept all these refugees in. And Biden himself, in his notes, is like, I'm worried about a political backlash by taking in all these refugees. I'd rather send them to another country. His people have a long memory of how the Syrian refugee crisis played out in 2015. They're seeing what's happening with the border crisis, that there's no way they control the border, and they're having hundreds of thousands of people come in without any way to put an impetus in their way. And he's seeing this now with the refugees, and he's like, this is not going to be good for me. It's not going to be good for me in 2022 and 2024. I don't want to do this. But Republicans are essentially doing it because they're begging for these refugees. So this situation is playing out, and even with the withdrawal, I've liked his public statements about Biden. And Biden is still terrible. I don't necessarily want to praise him, and I don't think it's necessarily wrong to make political capital out of how disastrous this withdrawal is, because this is, people, as I've said, people are kind of are cattle in a lot of ways. I'll talk about this more later on in the podcast, but most people are just like NPCs. They just like watch what's on TV. They don't have any long-term memory, don't have any really deeply felt principles when it comes to a lot of political issues, especially foreign policy, and they just like change their mind depending on what the TV is showing them. And they're seeing now these images. They're like, oh, the Taliban's in power. They're beating women. Oh, their people are falling from jets. This is all bad. I'm now thinking this withdrawal is a disaster. It is a disaster, but as I argued, this would have always happened no matter what, unless we stayed there permanently. But Biden was the only one who was ever going to get us out for reasons that I covered last week, but I just want to emphasize is that nobody else had, Biden, even more so than Obama, has the entire Democrat media complex on his side. He had his entire party was full on support in the withdrawal. He had the media that was full on support in the withdrawal. When the New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, all these places were praising Biden when he said, I'm going to withdraw us by September 11th. They were all ecstatic for this, while just a few months before they were screaming bloody murder over Trump saying the same thing. Of course it's hypocrisy, but we won't get into that. Trump, of course, didn't have that Democrat media complex on his side, and that Democrat media complex being on Biden's side forced the military to, hold its tongue and realize that they're outmaneuvered here. Whatever, we'll let they privately grumbled, but most of these reporters weren't carrying water for them because they didn't want to embarrass Biden. They love Biden, and he took down the tyrant that is Donald Trump. So they're not gonna publish any real criticism of him. And also, it seemed like the intelligence community was also on his side because they're much more closely aligned with the Democrat media complex than the military. That doesn't necessarily make the military good. That just because the military is bad in many other ways. It's just that the IC is more connected with the media, which makes the IC much more evil. But as it going along, it's shown that the Democrat media complex is also does have ties to the military industrial complex, and the intelligence community and all these people have decided to, wipe away, turn on Biden because first off, they don't want to be blamed for this, and second off, they want to reemphasize America as the world's policeman, as the sole global power that can go around and take over countries in the name of women's rights and LGBT rights. And they know they have the opportunity to score political points for their own agenda by attacking Biden and also avoiding blame for this because they don't want to have any blame for this stupid withdrawal. It's all Biden's fault for pulling us out. And I want to emphasize this. This is not necessarily Biden's. Biden, it ultimately takes his responsibility, but it makes more sense to, blame the globalist American empire for this stupid withdrawal because these are the generals, these are the State Department officials, these are intelligence officials, these are the NGO workers. Many of those people who are like, oh, we got to get the Americans out. Many of those 10,000 Americans who are still there are responsible for this whole debacle. They're the ones who spread the lies. They're the ones who, were involved in these stupid, woke, progressive initiatives that failed miserably in Afghanistan. And now we have to think that it's like some plumber on a work assignment there. It's like, there's some contractors there, and it's not like we should necessarily leave them behind, but it's like you have to realize like these people shouting the loudest about they're not getting me out. please let me out. Those people are responsible for this debacle. And they're a part of the globalist American empire. Now we're having to get them out when they were too stupid to think that this government was going to fail immediately and hightailing it to Kabul airport before the Taliban got there. But, regardless, I think that I want to really emphasize this point that, this would have happened no matter what. Biden was the only one who was ever going to get us out because he had the total loyalty to the Democrat media complex, which silenced the military and prevented the military from pushing these dangerous leaks and information, such as what happened with the Russian bounty story when Trump was trying to get us out there. They spread that in order to undermine Trump's ability to get us out of there. And Trump could have never done this because, one, his whole party was, party leadership was opposed to it. Mitch McConnell and Kevin McCarthy were definitely opposed to any serious withdrawal from Afghanistan. Meanwhile, Democratic leadership was totally behind Biden. And Biden's also partially senile and incredibly arrogant. And he knew that it would look bad for him if he abandoned his promise to get us out of there by September 11th. And he didn't matter the cost. And he's so arrogant. He's like the media. He has such contempt for the media because, as he should, because they're asking about what his favorite flavor of ice cream is. And they never ask him hard-hitting questions. And they're so subservient to him that he's like, I don't have to respect these people, which is right. He shouldn't have any respect for them. And so he's like, I don't care about them complaining about me. I'm going to pull us out and it doesn't matter. And he believes that ultimately the American people would reward him. But unfortunately, the American people are so susceptible to media propaganda that it may not work out for him. But, fortunately, he had that loyalty of the Democrat media complex for so long that when he could have made changes to this and actually stop the withdrawal, it was far too late. The media only started paying attention to this last week. And by then, it was way too late to go back on this promise. And it's way too late now. The Taliban controls the entire country, and they're negotiating with the remaining rebels to get their loyalty. So there's nobody on the ground who really wants us back, except for these NGO workers. So, he is the only one who's ever going to get us out. Obama was so worried about pressure that he was going to appear weak on Afghanistan, and he may have taken us out in a second term, but ISIS completely flipped the script on him. He had to show that he was taking terrorism seriously. He was taking all this criticism. He was much more thin-skinned about criticism than Biden. Biden is an arrogant idiot, so he just doesn't care about media criticism of him. While Obama rather is very sensitive to that, and he realized by 2014 he had to keep troops there to show that he's taking terrorism seriously due to ISIS. And many people were criticizing that the only reason that ISIS appeared was because he pulled out of Iraq, which further shows that these arguments about complaining about withdrawals are all arguments for forever war, no matter what conditions you have, because all these conditions are set by the military, and they're set by the military with the intended purpose of ensuring that we never leave. And the Afghan government also wanted those conditions so they can ensure that they're never met, so we'll stay there forever. It's like, well, you just got to meet the conditions for us to leave, but that's never going to happen. And yeah, so this would have, and so Biden was the only one. Trump had no power. Trump, if this is all happening under Trump, there would be a coup against him. There would have been not only impeachment, they would have actually voted there would have been enough Republicans to vote for his removal. The military would have been sending troops over to escort him off the premises. Mike Pence would be calling for the 25th Amendment. This is all would be happening if this had happened under Trump. But Trump probably wouldn't have ever done that because the generals and McConnell would have all threatened him with this possibility, and he would have had to cave. And he did that many times throughout his presidency. So Biden was the only one who was going to do it. And I think all these conditions about withdrawal, this was, of course, going to happen. There was no plan under Trump. There was never going to be a serious plan to get us out of there, because any plan that was going to get us out of there was we're going to require us to have a large military presence throughout the country. And many of these Americans didn't want to leave on time, and so did many of these Afghans, because the Afghan government doesn't want this idea of of just fleeing the country while there's still a government in place. And they just didn't expect the government to totally collapse. None of these people expected that. So it's hard to, attack Biden for an error he shares with the entire military establishment, the entire intelligence community, and the entire political establishment. So, it's fine, but it's also good that this is happening under Biden because, it will probably help the Afghan refugee situation, which we'll discuss more on later podcasts because I've already talked a little bit too much about this topic. And repeating some of the points I made last week. I just want to emphasize because it's the number one news story still. I think this will play well with Republicans and it is good, even though I think most people will still forget it by after Labor Day. Depending on if they meet their date, the deadline in August 31st. Taliban's saying you must meet that deadline or otherwise there's going to be consequences. We'll see. I still think that, once we're out of there, other news stories take place. The Afghan refugee is going to be the longer news story from that. But on this matter, Republican leadership is more desirous of these migrants than the Biden administration. So it's like the Republicans aren't even making hay about this, but they'll quickly change their position once they see the polling on this matter. And there's problems arise when they start to be processed and settled in these middle American communities. So of course we'll keep an eye on it. As I said, the deadline is next week, so we will probably cover more Afghanistan topics for next week. But that's all I'm going to discuss for today. As I said, I probably talked a little bit too long. I got a schedule to run here. I got deadlines. But we'll move along to the next topic that I promised we would discuss last week, and that of course is the United States Census, which finally was released this month and showed that whites have declined even more so than they were expected. I think they only expected whites to decline to 59 to 60% of the population, but instead they are down below 58% to 57.8%. And as I said last week, the number would probably even be closer to 55% if they had kept a separate category for Middle Eastern and North African people, which the Trump administration eliminated in 2019. And they were kept as white, which is a good thing because it prevented them from obtaining, certain advantages in the workforce, which everyone wants to fly from white because that gives them more advantages. So it would have even been lower. And there's now a explosion of people claiming, other or multiracial categories, which is likely a result of the flight from white. But before discussing the flight from white, we have to discuss how the news that the white decline occurred was greeted with rapturous applause from libtards. They love this news. This is the greatest news to them. Michael Moore said this is the best day in U.S. history. Jen Rubin was going ecstatic. Washington Post columnist who's a horrible person, and she still claims she's a conservative, despite all evidence to the contrary that she is not a conservative. And then also Jimmy Fallon's audience, when he announced the news, his audience broke out into cheers. The white population was declining, and even Jimmy Fallon was weirded out by his crowd's reaction. He's like, I didn't expect that response, but they were just going nuts at the thought that the white population is going down. And that audience was primarily white people. The people who are probably most ecstatic about whites getting replaced are white liberals. I don't know if even though this is a common conservative trope to claim that only whites care about race and that blacks and Hispanics are just, living life as it is. But it is true in this regard that white liberals generally care more about this issue and are more enthused by this issue than you would say the average black or Hispanic person. Especially when you're looking at Twitter. And this is the cause of the decline. They have really set, ever since they warned about, or not warned, but said that whites would be a minority. And that's been being said for about 30 or 40 years. This really became a trope in the 1990s. I'm not sure how much they talked about it in the 1980s. And this would have never been thought possible in the 1970s and 60s. And when the 1965 Immigration Act passed, I'm sure many of my listeners know this, they had promised that it would not dramatically affect American demographics. Of course, we know that it did dramatically affect American demographics, and further immigration legislation, particularly the 1990 Immigration Act, accelerated that process. So we know that that happened, and we know that that's what they were going on about. And that's what, the demographic change happened. So for the past, we'll say 30 or so years, they have talked about a white minority, America becoming a majority minority country. White majority no longer exists. It's a minority like everyone else. And this has been a goal for them, that once we reach that status, America can finally end racism and we finally become a rainbow nation and everyone just magically gets along and everything's hunky-dory. Well, we all know that's not going to happen. And they keep, putting down the time period when this is actually going to occur. It was originally stated at 2050. Then it's been 2042. I don't know why they came up with 2042. But I really think by 2030, due to the flight from white that's happening, the white population will probably hover around 50%. It may go even lower. It may dip. That may be the time that America officially becomes a majority minority nation. We'll have to see, unless there's a complete change in white racial consciousness between them. I mean, it could happen. I mean, crazier things happened in the last decade. We'll have to see. But I mean, if current trends are going, we would see the number further decline. I think you would have, the number decline. It was 63% in 2010, so we had a decline, of 6%. From about 6% from over 10 years, and if you saw another 6% decline, that would be around 51%. And it'll probably be more because I guarantee you they're going to get the separate minute category is going to happen by then. So I think you will, if they have the 6% and then you take away the minute category, which is around 2% of people, it will be around 50%. So maybe it might happen quicker, but it is this, as I keep saying, I'm getting into the subject, it's the flight from white. And even when analysis looked at why the white population decreased, it was the first time that the population number decreased, not just their percent share of the population, but their number in general decreased. And they're like, well, what happened? There's like 5 million missing whites. Some of it is due to demographic, that there was more whites were dying off than, white mothers were giving birth to white alone babies. That was one of the reasons that why it was that. But that wasn't most of it was people who were identifying as white before, now not identifying as white, particularly among Hispanics. Which just shows the flight from white phenomenon happening in full, is that these people 10 years ago were identifying as white alone on the census, white Hispanics. The majority of Hispanics were identifying that. Now it's minority of Hispanics identifying that. So there has been a massive change with how Hispanics view their identity, and that is representative of how America views white identity and the advantages granted by white privilege, is that now people don't want to identify as white. And so even, Castizos and others who are here in America, Cubans who, might have blue eyes, they might, if somebody sees them on the street, they may think they're Anglo, they're going to count themselves as non-white now. And that's going to occur for many other white Americans who are going to find some trace of Native American heritage, or pretend that they have Hispanic heritage or Black heritage. 23andMe things may make a lot of white people non-white. They're like, oh, I found 1% African in my DNA. I'm non-white. And they may use that to get advantages and privileges, because nobody wants to be white. It doesn't, we talk about it all the time about white supremacy and white privilege, impacting society. Yet, there are no added advantages by putting white on the census or putting white on an application. Your application, if all these corporations are striving for diversity and striving to find, the brilliant Black or non-white person of color to hire or to bring into their university, they're going to look at white and they're like, wow, I cannot, this person's not going to add to our diversity. And diversity is so important. Diversity is our strength. We're going to overlook this, and he points that he's Hispanic or American Indian. We're gonna hire this person, and and there's not as much fact checking that can happen. And we're seeing this. Australia is really funny. We're actually talking about Australia later, but Australia has this huge epidemic of white people claiming that they're Aboriginals or Aborigines. and they're and they get all these jobs, and it's so funny looking at these people because they're like Elizabeth Warren claiming she's Indian. These are like blonde hair, blue eyed people who are like, I am representing the Aboriginal people, and they're like the first Aboriginal like politician is now in charge, and it's like a blonde hair, blue eyed person who's wearing like tribal garb, and it's so ridiculous. And now they're like demanding like DNA testing and like and ancestry results to prove this because they have so many white people lying that they're Aboriginals just to get a university job, and this particularly problematic in Australian universities, but it's throughout Australian society where all these people just claim, oh yeah, I'm Aboriginal, and it's like they look at them and they're blonde hair, blue eyed, and you'll always see this too when you see interviews. They'll see somebody complaining about white settlers and white colonialism, and you look at this person like, you're white, and like, no, I'm Aboriginal. It's like, really? And so you're going to see that now in America, where the one thing is blacks do police their identity so much that they really, I mean, as we saw with the Rachel Dolezal case, is like lying about being black is really an unforgivable offense. And even Indians are policing it more. But as long as you can find any Indian heritage, like a great great grandfather or something, like, maybe you could do that. I mean, they do police. They don't police American Indian heritage. Black is like the toughest one to say because people can look and see. It's very easy to spot that. And blacks really, you really have to emphasize. And even like these black writers who look very white, such as Adam Swerver, Atlantic writer. He had. I remember his pen photo because people always accuse him of being white. His pen post was his like black grandparents who were like the parents of his mother. Like he's like, here's my grandparents, and it's like, here's my mom and dad, and that was his pen thread to show that he's black. Because if he has hair, he looks like a young Bernie Sanders. He of course shaved his head and goes to a tanning bed to make himself look blacker, but he, in a lot of pictures, especially if he's not been tanning, he looks white. And then and so this goes on for many other people that they have that they'll like insist that they're black. But I mean, blacks do police it and they do demand proof. And same with Indians. Indians the next most difficult thing. But Elizabeth Warren didn't suffer any consequences for lying about her heritage, and that very well got her a job at Harvard. So it's much tougher to prove Indian heritage too. Or tougher to disprove rather. And as long as you can show some heritage, and you have to remember is that when Elizabeth Warren was starting to announce her campaign, her first like big public announcement, like that was, a preview of the campaign, was announcing her DNA results, which initially just showed like it was like 1 or 2% of Indian heritage, and then of course it was 1/124th. And she was like, boom. And then like all the media, once again showing the Democratic media complex, was like racist Republicans own. She's totally Native American. And then they're like, actually we did the test and this only shows 1/124th. And then they completely ignored it. And then she gave an apology, and that was the end of it. She didn't really suffer any consequences. And there's some other academics who have been exposed as fake Indians, and they kept their job. Hispanic is probably another option that you can do, but you have to find some Spanish heritage. And there's like, I think Alec Baldwin's wife and some others who claim that they're Hispanic, yet they're like WASPs. So, how whites are going to do this is going to be tricky. Some of it, you're going to see some ethnic advocacy, probably from Italians, maybe from Irish, maybe from Greeks and from other groups that are demanding that we're not actually white because, there's a sign in 1850 who said that, there's some newspaper column that said we're not white, thus we're not white, and we demand minority privileges. And of course, Middle Eastern and North Africans are to demand that they're not white. And anyone, no matter how light-skinned you are, or how blue your eyes are, or blonde your hair is, if you have a Hispanic last name, you're of course claiming that you're non-white, and nobody can say it's like, oh, I'm from Colombia. And I know several people, like the Dominich family. This is another example of flight from white, and conservatives are very into this too. Is that the Dominich family, of course, Ben Dominich, in a lot of his other families politically connected. He always emphasizes that he's a person of color because his family comes from Puerto Rico, but his family were like the Castizo landowners there, and they have very light skin. I think they have light colored eyes. That you would never notice you would see them as ordinary white people. But they always emphasize that they're non-white, because they're people of color, because they come from a territory that's considered Hispanic. So any person who has like a vaguely Spanish last name, and maybe Italians are going to do this too, where it's like, they have an Italian surname. It's like, oh, it's actually Spanish. I'm non-white. So Italians may be at the forefront of declaring themselves non-white. Even Christopher Rufo is saying in his war against critical race theory, always emphasizes that, oh, my grandparents weren't considered white. They were considered Italian. They were never, I'm Italian. I'm not white. So there's going to be a ton of people who are going to do that. And it's politically advantageous. As I said previously, there's no advantage to being white. And people just want to find ways to exploit the system and get ahead in the system and find ways to survive. And one of the easiest ways to do that is to claim minority status. And how that's going to take place, we'll see. I think most white Italians are still going to claim they're white by 2030, but I think people are going to laugh at this too, because anti-Italian jokes are like Italian jokes that are vaguely ethnic jokes or racist jokes about Italians are like the only acceptable ethnic jokes now. And that's why the left loves it, because it's like the only thing that is politically correct that they can make jokes about. People would laugh about this, but there is going to be, a serious push for a lot of this stuff. I mean, and like various white ethnic groups are going to try to claim they're non-white, but, non-white groups are going to strongly police it, as is happening in Australia now, where they're now demanding like genetic tests and ancestry results to prove you're actually Aboriginal. From these white people claiming Aboriginal status. So there's many other things to consider with the census, but it is a little bit further away. And I always say, like, I'm going to have a longer talk about this, but some of the stuff is very blackpilling, and some of the things I want to think over some more before looking into. And this topic's not going away, but over the events of the last week, a bigger topic came to the fore, and it's something I really want to make the main discussion. I'm probably going to talk about this for the next 30 minutes. And that is I was mentioning Australia before, but that is this sense of, it is cliche now to say this, but the anarcho-tyranny that we're seeing in Australia and in America and in the Anglosphere in general, and how the resistance against it. As some of you guys have probably seen, is Australia is now on like super lockdown, where they will arrest people for getting fresh air from leaving from their home. There was a police chief who was on TV and is talking about how police officers went to this, checked up on a man at his home. They found he wasn't there. And while they're still there, he drove in and they're like, where were you? And he's like, I went to get some fresh air. And then they gave him like a citation and said that he's now subject to greater checkups. And there's now TV reports of like, if teenagers are outside partying, they're arresting them and giving them $1,000 fines. They're essentially arresting anyone who is outside getting fresh air. And even though there were riots or aggressive demonstrations over the weekend, many of these people, if they got arrested, are going to face like very hefty fines just for walking around outside. Not just that they're protesting, but that's like now a crime to go outside. And they've even warned about how you can't take off your mask to drink beer, and numerous other just ridiculous notions that is just like, they've completely eliminated freedom there, and they're using the military to go house to house to check on people to make sure that they're home and locked in. And it's a greater escalation of what we have seen from the COVID pandemonium and COVID panic, and how they are exerting more control over our lives now than ever before. When people saw what was happening in Australia, a lot of Americans said, thank God we have gun rights to ensure this never happens. It's like, tyranny will not happen here because we have gun rights. And I'm merely pointing out, like, I think this is a cope because we have had a lot of loss of our liberties since then. I mean, not to the same extent as Australia, but we've had, they're pushing vax mandates on us. They've had government instituted mask mandates. There were several people who were, last year, this hasn't happened that much this year, but last year, there were several people who were arrested for walking around without a mask on outside. There were many people. There were several cases, especially in the height of the lockdown in the spring of 2020, where police would show up at their doors and say, "We heard reports that your kids were playing outside. We want to check on that and make sure that doesn't happen again." We saw a lot of that, and that's despite of having guns. And even if you want to see if it's, they're really pushing things all over the place. And even if you have to look at the tyranny that the government sanctioned these riots last year, during the BLM riots. And if you brought a gun to this situation, to defend tyranny, to defend your business or defend your livelihood or really even defend your life, you faced, very serious charges for ever using a gun in any of these scenarios to defend yourself or your property. There was the bar owner in Oklahoma who took his life after they pressed murder pretty sure, I forget if it was manslaughter or murder charges. I'm pretty sure it was manslaughter charges against him because he acted in self-defense. These people attacked him in his bar. They attacked him in his bar, and the only way he could protect himself is to use his gun, and he defended himself. And then they arrested him for that. Gun rights being used against the tyranny of a government-sanctioned mob. Yeah, that happened. Of course, Kyle Rittenhouse. Many other examples. And I don't really see of any example of the police being like, oh, this person is a gun owner. We're not going to go enforce the mask mandate or go to their home to make sure that they're not going outside. I don't think that's ever crossed the scenario of any of these law enforcement. And guns have never been a consideration for why they shouldn't do anything. Like they would of course pass all these mandates regardless of whether people have guns or not. And it's the same even with these. They don't really view guns as threatening, as threatening as you would think. They will hyperventilate about it, but I have to think about the Michigan, those protests last year against the lockdowns. People stormed in the Michigan Capitol with guns. They didn't care. They're just like, okay. Because they knew that they weren't going to use them. It was just there for show and tell. It was there for show. And there's always been this notion that gun rights are needed because people always, I'm pro gun rights. Don't get me wrong. I'm pro guns. I think gun culture is one of the good things that it's like a way that it is, for normal Americans to express, that they're not politically correct, that they are upholding American traditions and American heritage. I'm 100% gun rights. I'm firmly opposed to gun control. I'm not in favor of it at all. And I know the gun owners are our people. And so I always defend that. But I think, people get the wrong reasons for why we have gun rights. And the main reason to have gun rights is so you can defend yourself and your property. That makes you a full citizen, is that you don't have to rely, if people break into your home, you can take care of that if you're a gun owner. You're showing that you are a citizen who's capable of taking care of themselves and defending themselves, their family, and their property. You want to call police. Police are still there. It's not like, oh, we don't need police, but it's like showing you're an independent citizen and you can take care of yourself. And it gives you the right to defend yourself. And that's a part of the system, is that you don't have to rely on the state, to hopefully send a social worker over to make sure the home invader doesn't torture your family to death. It's like you have the right and the ability to protect yourself with that. And that's why people have gun rights. So gun rights are very important for self-defense, and it's a necessary part of your home and your life. It's like having a toolbox. It's something you need to defend yourself. But now people, they don't use this practical reason to have guns. And I think that's, I've seen a lot of articles written, is that one of the reasons that we don't have these, the type of home invasions that Europe have. Europe has, even in areas that are very safe, there is many reports of these country chateaus and country homes that are, suffer these really brutal home invasions. A lot of them committed by Eastern Europeans, but that's not here or there. Is that one of the reasons that this is a very rare occurrence in America is because people know that if you invade a home, there's a greater likelihood if you invade a home, especially in rural or suburban area, that homeowner is armed and is going to use that against you, and you're not going to walk out of there. Europeans don't have to worry about that. They can just, these guys can just march in, they may have a hunting rifle. That's not going to do anything. And thus they're able to take advantage of there. So that does protect, and it does protect your property, and it's a big part of American tradition is that you had to have a firearm on you when you were on the American frontier, when you were a farmer. It was a necessary part of life, and we carry on that tradition. But it's not necessarily like, oh, you have a gun. The state is afraid of you. The state is not. I mean, Biden makes this point all the time, and people always want to say, well, look at Afghanistan, look at Vietnam. Like we had all these weapons and they didn't work against us. Well, I mean, it's a very different situation here. And he's like saying, and Biden does make a point. It's like we have all the power in this country. We're not afraid of your guns, and I think they show that, with the Michigan Capitol storming, and that the fact that they're willing to impose all these mandates on us. Regardless of gun rights. I mean, we have to look at the real reasons that some of this tyranny that we're seeing in Australia and UK and other places doesn't happen here, and in Canada doesn't happen here. And it is not because of gun rights. As you can look at all the public statements, I don't think none of these people have ever been afraid that these guys are going to use them. And even when comments, when I made this stuff, they're like, well, you're just saying we should go shoot these people. I'm like, I'm not saying that. But I mean, the fact that you would just say that that's like a ridiculous idea is like showing that, they don't really have to worry about that. I mean, it's not like saying this. It's like, not like, I know these people are just like saying, like they even admit that they're not going to, that they're like, that ideas that you would think that about defending your rights is just like completely insane. It's like, yeah, you understand this. And it's also completely counterproductive. It's like one guy going taking on the police is not going to stop them. It's actually going to probably give them more ammunition to go with these mandates and even to impose gun control. And even other people are like, well, let's see them try to take my guns away. Well, that's one point, but that's not your only liberty. And I think there would be resistance towards that, but not necessarily like an armed militia uprising that is imagined in all these scenarios of like why we need guns. Is like the citizens are just going to bond together, and thanks to their guns, they're going to take down the government. It's like, I don't think that's going to happen. I think, that's not in any recent time frame, I would say. But the reason why there would be pushback is that all these governors, and we've seen this a lot with the mask and vax mandates, as there'd be pushback from local authorities and state authorities, and it would create, this tense situation that would not easily resolve itself. I don't necessarily think it would be the start of a revolution or a civil war, but that's where it would come from. And it's almost this diffusion of authority that's a main reason that we can't accomplish, thankfully can't accomplish these things that the UK, Canada, and Australia are doing with their insane COVID lockdowns, is because there's a diffusion of authority. Joe Biden can issue an order, but half the states can just ignore it and just not follow it. And there's also local jurisdictions are going to decide we don't want to follow this. And there's just so much diffusion of power and authority in our society. Now it's great. There's a greater centralization of course, far more so than it was in our nation's past. But we still have a greater decentralization and diffusion than other countries do, especially in the Anglosphere. So that's one reason. I mean, that's like the stated reason. Another reason that they don't want to do these things is because the main people they would have to go after to ensure compliance, it's not real whites. It's blacks. It's Magic Americans they would have to go after. And especially post-Floyd riots, they don't want this idea of just like sending, I hate the term Karen, but they would have to send in Karens. They send in these double masked, like fat white women into like a ghetto with her like little notebook, checking on doors like, excuse me, oh, is Jamal following mask orders? And then like she's gonna expect to get walloped by this black guy, or they're just gonna videotape her as like, you call me a racial slur. I'm like, no, I didn't. I love power to George Floyd. And they're like, it would be a disaster for them, because any of these type of things that they would have to do, they're just having to make Magic Americans comply with these orders is just a magnitude that's just not going to happen. Even if you're looking at New York City with their vax mandate, from people I know who are living up there, they have said they have not been carded yet. It's kind of like, it's on the books, but it's not actually being enforced. And if you can look at what's happening in Europe, they have cops walking around, going to restaurants being like, we need to see your card. We need to scan it. We need to make sure it's authentic. We're going around. Are you vaxxed? Are you at this restaurant? We need to see this. And they're doing this throughout every country. You could not see this in America, in a large part because they would have to be going and harassing blacks for this compliance. And post Floyd, that's one reason why they're probably not strongly enforcing the vax mandate in New York City, because they realize that the main people they're going to target are going to be banned from restaurants and gyms and going around and making sure they have the vax are Magic Americans. It's blacks. They're not, and they want to avoid the bad optics of that. So they're not just checking. They'll have these laws in the books, but it's not aggressively enforced because of that fear of looking racist, and also that they'll, like, blacks will fight back against it. Even though blacks, I've seen, is like, people have noticed that they're more zealous mask wearers than rural whites. In a lot of places, you'll even see like people, and like most of these cases where you see like really bad violence from New York City, like somebody getting beaten or whatever, like the black suspect is usually wearing a mask, or it has like the mask under his chin. In all scenarios, no matter how crazy or violent they are, they're wearing the mask, but they're just not getting the vax. So they do have that level of compliance. But I think and even if they were getting asked to, like, for their proof of ID, even if they were vaccinated, like, blacks really don't like that. Like, they really, really, really don't like that. In any scenario, even if they're like, there's nothing wrong, they get very mad about it. I mean, you can see this from like when they're pulled over for speeding. A lot of these cases where it's like, oh, there's police brutality. It's like this guy. The officer's like, hey, can I see your license and registration? And then the guy blows up on the police officer for getting pulled over. The like minor nuisances and like being asked for proof of things and like being denied things does irritate. I mean, it irritates all people, but with whites, they will grit their teeth and just go along with it because, whites have been trained to be, nice, respectful, and follow bourgeois norms. They don't want to cause a scene. Blacks aren't like that. It's like asking blacks to quiet in a movie theater. Good luck with that. You're putting your own life in hands, because there's so many news stories of like gun shooting happens, and it's like, what happened is like somebody told them to shush in a movie theater, so they don't. At any movie theater I've been at where somebody asked Magic Americans to hold it in for a little bit while we're watching the movie, they erupt and make even more noise and act outraged that you were there or asked that. So I don't think the authorities realize this, that they impose a system that like Australia has and stuff. Is like they would not go for it. They would not go for it. I mean, they've already accepted the mask, but this is a bridge too far to ask for the type of identification they want. So that's another reason that we've had this. And so you all want to put it on gun rights and like, the revolution will happen. If this one threat to our liberty occurs, it's like, you have to look at it. It is a cope. It's not saying gun rights are bad or guns are bad. Guns are good. Gun rights are good. We're strongly opposed to gun control. But to think that like your AR-15 is going to stop government tyranny is a cope. Like, that will help you protect your home. That'll help you protect your family. But it's not going to protect you from, tyranny. And I think you just got to what really protects against tyranny is strongly organized communities. Competitive authorities are different authorities that can challenge, state, centralized authority. Those are the type of things that, resist government tyranny. I mean, it's like if it's much more effective to have a closely knit community that is going to, where the sheriff, the local authorities are like, we're not going to enforce these rules, and these are our friends, and we're not going to allow, the FBI to come in our area to enforce whatever. They're going to have to send the federal authorities in, and they're sending the federal authorities into a neighborhood where all the neighbors are together and they're friends, and they're going to be outside protesting and, making it very difficult for the FBI to enforce these mandates. It's like tightly knit communities and an organization and diffused authorities and authorities that have the balls to challenge centralized authority, that's a much better resistance toward tyranny than just one person owning an AR-15, because that person AR-15, that's a powerful weapon. But if it's just you alone, you're not going to take on an entire army battalion. I'm sorry to say. No matter what the movies tell you, that's just not going to happen. Or you're not even going to take on the cops when they come to your place, for the most likely scenario. I mean, you have to have people around you. You have to have people to support you, and you can't resist tyranny alone. One man is not one man cannot do it alone, and one man is no man. You have to do this within a group and within a community, within a structures and institutions that can effectively resist against this, and that's a much better hindrance to state authoritarianism than whatever Rambo fantasy you have. These fantasies are a part of America's like hyper individualism that we have, that we think of like, oh, I can do all this alone. But I mean, even how America's heritage is, it was like communities of people with their families, with friends, with their with their kin, settling these communities, settling the frontier, making this country what it is. It wasn't just like one individual doing something and then it's like, oh, I'm another individual too. We'll come together on a social contract and that's how we'll make the country. It's like, no, it was usually groups of people and collectives and communities that made this country. And people, hyper individualism isn't going to stop tyranny. As we're seeing, it actually makes tyranny more possible, because as people are atomized and isolated, it makes it far easier for the state to exert itself, because the only authority that people will recognize is state authority. And if they just have to deal with little atomized individuals in their own little homes and doing their own little business, they're easier to control. They're easier to contain. If you sending cops into a neighborhood and you only have to worry about that one home, it's no big concern. But if you're sending, forces or whatever to enforce something into a neighborhood or a community where the whole community is going to be hostile to you, that's a very different scenario. Very different. It makes it much more difficult for them to enforce their will. So, yeah, it's like, and so that's like the same thing with the gun ownership. It's like this high, one man is not going to take on an army battalion, no matter what. The final thing I want to bring up about what we're seeing in Australia and elsewhere, and even America, besides going on in gun rights or COPE, some people are probably going to be very upset about that. People got very upset about that when I was tweeting that, and some people began indulging in their base militia fantasies, which, I mean, you got to look at. I will make a few points about this before we go into the next subject. I have to look at this. It's like the same mentality as what was behind those idiots in Michigan who got conned into a terror plot by federal informants and federal agents against the governor of Michigan, where it's like, oh, we're going to kidnap her, or we're gonna overthrow the government with just like 15 people. And I was like, step back and look at how ridiculous you are, and you were easily manipulated by federal agents and federal informants with this attitude. And it's the same thing, and you're like, oh, well, we'll be free of federal informants and federal agents. Like, really? It's like there's nothing more that federal agents and federal informants do than having people do paramilitary training. It's like, that's a federal felony. Oh yeah, dude, get some illegal weapons too, and definitely make some illegal adjustments to your weapons too, and make sure you tell me about that as well. They like all these ideas, and so. Yeah, there's nothing more the federal government likes more than you guys indulging in those fantasies, as they get to make their quota. They get to make their big arrest for that. I mean, there's probably several FBI agents who made nice promotions and nice pay raises, including the one who beat his wife and got arrested. I bet he got a nice pay raise and bonus for nabbing those guys. So, make sure you're not saying stuff and doing things that is going to get you federal attention and being an idiot. So that's the last thing. Now I'm going to go on to what I was saying is like the growing authoritarian nature and the way things are going. I think it's like, the one thing I've always heard as a kid is that the great thing about living in America, and this is by extension the West, is that we have freedom. We have democracy. The rest of the world, they don't have freedom. we're the only place with freedom. And it's like, and as a kid, and a lot of kids had imagined that, like, in other countries and dictatorships, you're not allowed to go outside without asking for permission or authority. And it's like, authorities don't let you be what you want to grow up to be. And we have all these childish notions about like how freedom operates in America. We always like, I love our country because we have just so much freedom. We are able to protest and we're able to vote. And this is something that the rest of the world can't understand. And now we're having to come to the conclusion that Afghanistan seems to be, at the moment, a freer place than Australia. The Taliban isn't arresting people for the crime of going outside and getting fresh air. The Taliban is not, and also it's easier to stage a protest. It's like, well, maybe not for long, but there was a guy who's planning a protest and he got arrested in Australia and he got 8 months in jail. 8 months in jail. And there was another guy who got ratted on by his wife for not following their draconian COVID regulations. And he had to spend a whole weekend in jail for like stepping outside. This is the West now. It's like, and that's just with COVID regulations. We also have the hate speech laws where you can't, and you also can lose your bank account for alleged hate speech or being a political dissident. And you can be hounded, and they allow and tolerate Antifa to harass you and physically assault you, as we constantly see. I mean, they don't care about Antifa's violent protests. I mean, compare this. Owen Schroyer was just arrested, or I think he just turned himself in today. I think he had to turn himself today for this warrant, but an arrest warrant was put out for him last week for the crime of being on the Capitol stairs during January 6th. He wasn't really doing anything criminal. He was just on the stairs, and he was in a restricted area. And there's been a few other people who've been, at least two who were arrested for simply, they didn't enter the Capitol. They said that their speech was encouraging the crowd or whatever. They led a violent disruption of a official proceeding. There's one guy who's head of Cowboys for Trump who got arrested for the exact same crime as Owen Schroyer. He led the crowd in a prayer atop the Capitol stairs, and the dude was held in jail for a month in January and February. So, this is freedom now. It's like, if you have a protest that the authorities really don't like, they can hold you in jail for a month. And they can use your free speech and your disgust for the current government to keep you locked up. I mean, it's the same with a lot of these January 6th protesters. They use the fact that they don't accept President Biden as a legitimate president, which, you have the freedom to do. You're supposed to have the freedom to do that. The last three presidents, people accepted. There were many, many people who thought that they weren't legitimate. There were many people who thought that George W. Bush wasn't legitimate. Many people who thought that Barack Obama wasn't legitimate. Yet many people in CNN and in the halls of power who thought Trump wasn't legitimate. None of those people were arrested for that crime. None of those people faced additional hostility or scrutiny or additional jail time due to that belief. But if you do not accept Joe Biden as the legitimate president, which it should be your freedom to believe that regardless, that makes you a terrorist, and that makes you liable to being held in jail without bail. That's the new standard. That's in the land of the free, everybody. That's the land of the free. That is where freedom reigns, is here in America. That's the standard. It's very much like how the Roman Empire demanded all its subject people. It's like, you can have whatever religion you want, but you must make sacrifices and worship the emperor. And now with our country, it's like, you can be involved in whatever degeneracy or whatever frivolous activity you want, but you must accept the legitimacy of President Joe Biden. You must accept the legitimacy of this, and you can't have any problems with this government either. If you're protesting, mask mandates or vax mandates, that might make you a terrorist. As the Department of Homeland Security put out in their terror advisory, as Kabul was falling, they put out a terror advisory saying, we're worried about an uptick in terror attacks because people are still questioning the 2020 election, and they're still opposing vax and mask mandates. So that's the standard now. That makes you a terrorist just for your political thought. And you have to think about, it's like Nick Fuentes. I mean, he was put on a no-fly list and had $500,000 taken away from him by the federal government due to his political beliefs, due to his no crimes he was committing, no terrorism he's supporting, just because he runs an internet show that the authorities don't like, and they were able to use this power. So it's really, freedom. I have to say, the freedom that we're now offered is really overrated, because it's really the freedom to, indulge in like all these type of vices and degeneracy, but the authentic freedom of expressing political dissent, genuine political dissent, not the leftist like Antifa, AstroTurf political dissent that the authorities are fine with, and then they are easy and they're able to manipulate them to doing their dirty work for them. That's not genuine political dissent. Genuine political dissent is the stuff that gets you on a no-fly list or gets you, held in jail indefinitely without bail. That's the type of stuff. And none of these people, none of these Antifa or down with the system leftists had ever worry about this. Most of these leftists who are involved in the firebombing of the federal building in Portland, the federal courthouse in Portland, had their charges dropped. And they were fighting cops, throwing, bottles at them, throwing rocks at them, throwing projectiles at them. None of those people had to worry about serious criminal charges. While people who had the mere mistake of not knowing where a restricted area is on the Capitol, I don't think they're going to extend this, because I think the misdemeanor of being like on a step of grass that's like this arbitrary barriers that hadn't been well established. I don't think they're going to go after people for that. I mean, there is even the situation that, in all these, for the Owen Schroyer indictment, they're showing all these pictures and he's right next to Alex Jones, and they're like, well, they're not arresting Alex Jones, so why are they going after Owen Schroyer? The main reason is I think they can get the charges to stick better to Schroyer, because Schroyer had a suspended sentence where they mandated he do all this community service, and he was barred from disruptive behavior and on Capitol grounds, and now they're using that to charge him, and they think that they can get him for a lengthier sentence due to that. And so I don't know, but we don't really know. They can do whatever they want. This is the land of the free. And you have to really say is like, all this propaganda we've been fed throughout our lives about freedom and living in a free country is just bullshit. It's especially bullshit now. This isn't like, we don't really have authentic freedom here. And it's not the type of, and if our founders were here and if our ancestors were here and we're looking at our country, they would recognize it's not a free country. This is not, the free speech is being, cut by, suffering death by 1,000 cuts. You have to walk into a restaurant and prove you're vaccinated. You may show proof, but you're not. You cannot show proof to vote. That's racism. But it's not racism to enter a restaurant or a grocery store and show that you've been vaccinated. That's their twisted logic that they have, and so this is the system that we live in. There's still more freedom here in America than in some other places, especially when it comes to the COVID stuff. We don't have France, where you're eating at a restaurant and you have to worry about cops, showing up and demanding your vax passport. We're not there. We're not at that point yet. We still have more freedoms, but it's, I think this whole last year or so has really dispensed with the propaganda that we have. And I think that's ultimately a good thing. It's bad that we're losing these freedoms, but it's also very good because we never really had having people believe that stuff is what's led to a lot of the stupidity with America, from demanding that we bring freedom to other foreign countries, that we let these millions of people in so they can now experience freedom. And our country is so great and exceptional. And now we can undermine that. We know we can recognize it as bullshit, and millions of Americans do. And now that begins the process of having a proper consciousness about where to move next and how we can actually save this country, rather than let freedom ring, being this jingoism that imagines that the only place you can buy ice cream and peace is America, which you can't even do that anymore. Which that was like the type of mindset of these people who were urging for the invasion of Iraq. They're like, we're the only place where you can, like, they're like licking some popsicle or something. They're like, this is the only country where I can do this. It's like, this is freedom. And it's like, okay, that's really great. And now they can't even do that without showing, there may come a time where they can't even do that without showing proper documentation that they got a vaccine. Or they may be barred from that because they were engaged in hate speech and they deny their payment. They deny their payment. We don't accept. We won't sell popsicles to racists. So that's the land of the free. And so I think I always want to emphasize that it's good that these lies die. I mean, yeah, it's a tough process where we learn this stuff, and it's not easy. It's like it is pretty disheartening and demoralizing. But it's ultimately good that we have to have these lies fall before us and lie totally discredited in order to move in a positive direction. So that's the one white pill I want to take from that. So we'll see how a lot of these things play out in Australia and whether there will be a major pushback against the tyranny in Australia. The one final point, this is actually kind of black pill, is that a lot of Australians support this stuff. I don't know if it's necessarily the majority who supports like the full-on majority supports the like super lockdown and like shooting the anti-lockdown protesters, but people are able to be pushing this due to propaganda. I pointed this out earlier in the podcast, and it's even happening with America where a majority of the population supports vax mandates and mass mandates for kids as well. And it's just because the television screen tells them this. And another thing that people need to learn is that a lot of normies really don't like this idea, but most people don't have independent thought. They're just led by whatever they see on TV. And if the TV tells them that this is the right thing to do, they believe it. And that's the power of propaganda. But I think you don't necessarily, the one white pill I want to say about that is that those people their thoughts can be easily changed by a minority who is promoting the truth and being aware of the truth. And you can easily shift these people's opinions depending on if you have the control of the media and the propaganda in order to push them in the right direction. Because generally most people don't have deeply held principles and beliefs. They go where the wind is blowing or whatever the TV is telling them to go. So that's both a white pill and a black pill. You just have to realize that and understand that that's like the importance of getting our message out there. So these people do realize there's an alternative, that there is, a truth that they try to hide and try to keep away from the masses. And once it's effectively articulated and argued, many of these people would probably switch their opinions to our side. So that's the one white pill I want to suggest, and I want to move on now to the cognitive elite questions. Today's a little bit different, but I first want to give, of course, my pitch for signing up for the cognitive elite option at highly respected Substack, so that you can have the power. I want to emphasize this. You can have the power to ask me questions or guest questions or suggest guests and topics if you sign up for the cognitive elite option at highly respected Substack, and that's highly-respected.substack.com. This one's a little bit different today because I suggested this topic on Twitter. There's this video of a brawl occurring at a Pittsburgh Steelers preseason game, and I said I could do a whole podcast about it. I'm not doing a whole podcast about it, but I'm doing a whole segment about it. And it did become a cognitive elite question when one of my cognitive elite members, Tim, asked me I want to hear your thoughts about this. So I'm going to give my thoughts about this and explain the scenario. So how this video begins, of course, if you keep seeing these like brawls at NFL games, it's probably with the prevalence of cell phone cameras, and cell phone cameras have been around for many years now, but the seeming that people are more prone to pull them out whenever they see a brawl about to occur. There was a major brawl. I'll describe the Steelers situation. I'm getting off topic. I got to describe what the video is because many of the listeners may not know the video. Anyway, there's a viral video of a white woman, blonde-haired white woman, middle-aged, confronting a young black man. He's a pretty bigger guy. and he's got glasses on. The glasses come into play later. They're in an argument, and the white woman's getting in his face and poking at him and pushing him and just like screaming at him. It's unclear what they're arguing over. The black guy says, "Don't touch me," pushes her. White woman slaps in the face, knocks off his glasses. Black guy, rushes in acting like he's going to attack her. The white woman, of course, pulls away. The man next to her, which it's either her husband or boyfriend. It may just be a random bystander, but it's likely her husband or boyfriend, because this guy was just standing there the whole time watching the woman getting in an argument with this guy and doing nothing. And then when the guy starts charging her, he jumps into the fray, punches the guy, gets in a fight. The white guy, of course, or the guy with the white woman is white. The guy's fighting is black. The black guy knocks him out, just like brutally pummels him and knocks him out. And like the white woman eventually has to like protect her man from the blows, or whether it's a random bystander or just like a simp standing up for the woman. Unclear. It's likely the husband or boyfriend. And eventually, there's all this crowd around them when the fight starts, but then the crowd clears out by the time that they're fighting. And once the black guy sort of calms down, then some other people go in and they hold him and they're like, "Oh, don't fight." And this whole scenario, nobody intervened to, the couples has gotten the shit kicked out of them, both of them, by the black guy. The black guy's like calm. And then, there's a crowd. The rest of the crowd seems, if you had seen a guy whip the shit out of a woman, you would think that the crowd would be just like horrified, and there have been like men charging to beat this guy up and like, "How dare you?" But in this crowd, it was a black guy versus a white couple. The whole crowd had sympathy for the black guy. There was like these women in the background and like, "Hey, find his glasses, look for his glasses, like help him find his glasses." And they're like, she started it, and there's this. And there's just like so many social trends that I'm interested in that happen in this video. And I think the first one is like how trashy and pro like NFL fan culture is. Like, as I was saying earlier when I was starting this up before I had to describe the video, is that there's like all these like fight videos from NFL games, and every fight video is like the same. It's these fat, like slovenly people in oversized jerseys. You really can't, most of the time you can't figure out the race. Like there was this huge brawl at a Los Angeles Rams game. All the guys were Rams fans too, which like you would think that some of these brawls are happening between like rival fans, but it's usually like they're same fans. I don't know. It's like somebody spilled a drink on each other or whatever. And it's like all these Hispanics are like racially ambiguous people getting into this brawl. And then also in this case, it was also where punches started being thrown due to a woman, a horribly obese woman. I think she's Hispanic. Like she's on the bottom. They're already calming down. She throws a drink on one of the guys, and there's like 6 guys in between her and this dude. And this dude just like launches out, starts punching people left and right. Because a drink was thrown on him from their crowd, and that would make you angry, especially when you're already angry. And just a brawl breaks out. And there's several of these other cases, and you saw this in like the trashy scenario. And it's like these people are getting drunk and like getting violent arguments over probably something stupid. And it leads to a brawl for no reason at all. So that's one thing. The thing is like how like it emphasizes my my stances on sports fandom. It's really thinking like NFL is just like American trash culture all coming together. Just like terrible clothing, obesity, terrible behavior and manners, and just like fights over like stupid reasons, like some of your foot's in my way or something, or you spilled a drink on me and didn't know how to say sorry correctly. It's like something like this stuff. So that's one thing to come into play. And you saw this from the rest of the crowd. They're all in oversized jerseys and cargo shorts. Other factor, as before I get into the racial angle, actually this will bring in the racial angle, is that women starting fights that they obviously can't finish, and they do things that if it was a man doing, they would know that they're going to get their ass knocked out, or they're going to get, punched. And it's like, several people I talked to about this scenario, they're like, I've seen so many situations like that at a bar where a woman's like slapping or throwing a drink in a dude's face, and there's like, they have the expectation that nothing will happen to them. And I mean, as a society, we should have that standard to a certain extent, because it's like, yeah, I mean, a fully grown man who's like big and strong versus like a tiny woman, it's like, yeah, you shouldn't like be throwing haymakers at her for throwing a drink on her. But it's also at the same time, it's like women expect no consequences for their behavior, either slapping. And if this had been a white guy, it likely wouldn't have. That white guy would have likely not. This would have not happened in the situation. But we have to. I mean, even though it's cliche, like imagine the races reverse. Of course, if this was the races reverse, where one white guy beat the shit out of a black couple, it would have been treated as a hate crime of the century. Not only would it have been treated as a hate crime of the century, but the rest of the crowd would have jumped on that guy and beaten the shit out of him. Absolutely would have happened, and nobody would have been sympathizing with him and saying, well, his glasses are down. No matter how justified he was, it would have been treated as a hate crime of the century, and the crowd would have jumped on him just because of the training that we've had, is that like white versus black, you always have to stand with the black people. That's what media propaganda has done, especially to sports simps. I mean, sports simps are the primary victims and the primary targets of this media brainwashing. So that, of course, those sports fans would go into that. But even if you saw this scenario with a white guy versus a white couple, you would probably see that similar dynamic play as well. Like, even if with the same situation is like the white woman slapped him, and the guy started punching her and beating up the guy, there have been a lot more. There would have also been guys charging at that dude and beating him up. They would just not seen it as like hate crime of the century. It would have just been seen as like asshole punches woman in the face, and it's like, how dare you? But with the since it's a black guy, pretty much everyone on social media was defending him, and I don't want to necessarily defend his behavior, but I mean, he is what it is, and it's like a woman has to realize if you're like gonna slap a dude, you should expect like violence to come back from you, especially if it's a black guy who is saying "don't touch me" and he's willing to act on his threats. And that's in the scenario. And there was, and there were several people who are defending him. And this, the Pittsburgh Steelers #1 receiver, Juju Smith-Schuster, he went in there as like, "Yo, my pop said if a woman lays hands on me, it's go mode." And then everyone's like, "Thank you, Juju, for standing up for this." And then, like, even the media condemnations, like if it had been like wide receiver defends man beating woman, no race is involved either. It's like black guy versus black woman, or white guy versus white woman, or especially white guy versus black woman. There have been hell to pay for that wide receivers making that comment. But even if I was looking at media attention, they're just saying, "Oh man, that's poor form. We shouldn't be encouraging fighting." It's like it was like he celebrated another dude knocking out another guy who'd started a fight. It was like, "Oh man, that's bad form. Don't encourage fighting. Come on." But that's also where the racial dynamics are playing. Is like we're have this attitude where it's and there's been several scenarios where I've seen this, and I've covered this on past podcasts. There was this story about in Richmond where this woman, a black guy grabbed her ass and she threw a drink and she threw like water on him and charged at him. And then this guy knocked the shit out of her, and the whole social media was like, this woman was about to commit a hate crime, and he was threatened. He was in fear of his life, and that this woman was really gonna violently assault him. And then this woman learned the hard way that she gonna get knocked out. And then the whole crowd there that was witnessing this then laughed and pointed at her and like talked about how she got knocked the fuck out. And it's like, imagine this scenario with a white guy and a white woman, completely different reaction, from both social media and the grocery store, if that had occurred. But due to it being, and especially with the fact that like in this scenario, like she was justified to like throw like a cup on the guy. I mean, she should have realized that like this guy is much bigger than her and is going to knock her out, and she can't charge at him. But he was in the wrong, and he's like he slapped her ass and is like demanding her to show her ass, and it's like that's rude behavior that you don't expect from white people. But if that nobody was ever going to defend a white guy in this scenario if it had occurred. But if it's a black guy, it then turns into we're knocking out a racist Karen, even though this woman looked like she was Antifa, dyed hair, tattoos, and she's living in Richmond, Virginia, and shopping at a black grocery store, which likely she's a huge leftist. The difference is, well, we really don't know what happened in the Steelers game. I don't think it was something serious. It was probably like a minor disagreement the woman flipped out on, because I think the man, if it wasn't just a bystander, the man would have been more involved in like yelling at the guy if it had been something serious, like she had smacked her ass or something, or had called her like a foul word. I think the man next to her, unless he was just like a guy she didn't really know or just a friend, he would have been more involved in it. I guarantee you that was just like something like very stupid that they were arguing over. I don't think there was as much justification. And so there's like two ways to take this scenario. It's like I saw some people online, especially the right, who are, it's just like all, women are cashing, or, they're sending checks they can't cash, and it's finally her learning a lesson that she can't act in an obnoxious behavior and overbearing manner that in public, and she learned the hard way, that her actions come with consequences. There's one way to put with that, and I know there's a tempting way to say that, but at the same time, you have to look at the larger reaction to it, and you can't ignore the racial dynamic. And if this had just don't even do races reverse, but if this had been a white guy, that guy would have been seen as the enemy. They've been demanding criminal charges against him. That wide receiver, there have been Pittsburgh players like, this guy's not a real Steeler. He is a insult to the entire Steelers nation. And other fans would have jumped in to beat the shit out of this guy. That the racial dynamics can't be ignored, because those play a central role into this. No matter how much, yes, we all see like drunk, irate, obnoxious women get involved in this stuff, but at the same time, they're women, and unless they're really like really in a society, there's no way you can win in this scenario unless you're black, because if you're a white guy and you take a punch, you just beat up, a much smaller individual, and you lose your honor, you lose your ability to call yourself a gentleman. And that's like that. There's no win in that scenario, and you could be likely hit with like very serious assault charges that would have not been hit if you're just like punching another guy. So there's like several things you have to worry about. With blacks now, they have the power to punch women and get away with it, which is quite the superpower, because that's one of the few crimes in our society that they still consider a serious felony, is a man punching a woman. And if blacks can find a justification for it, as seen in the Richmond grocery store or in the Steelers at the Steelers game, they will take it, and they will be seen as the hero in the story, and everyone will come to their aid and applaud them, as happened in this Steelers clip. And it's also why nobody interfered. So it is like conclusion, as I said, like why there's so much to say about this. One, it demonstrates trash NFL pro culture. Two, it demonstrates also like the cowardliness of a lot of these crowds, especially with the there's like a massive fight breaking out. There are several men around, and they don't do anything to interrupt it. And we've seen several fights where there's like a white guy or Hispanics, and like people will jump in. But for whatever reason, and it's like primarily white guys around, they fear that black guy more than they would probably another white guy. And this guy is pretty big, but he's not like a giant. He's like a big guy. I mean, it's like you probably wouldn't want to get in a fight with him unless you're a really well-trained fighter or a big guy yourself. But still, and like these white guys who show up at the end, they're like dudes who could have jumped in, like held him back, or if like 3 or 4 of them, they could have easily stopped that fight, but they didn't interfere until the guy had calmed down and he was like already showing he was like not throwing punches anymore. And this is likely due to the racial factor, I think, much more so, because I think if it had been a white guy punching a white woman, they would have all jumped in. But the black guy, then they just like, lightly touch it, like lightly grab his shoulder and like, oh, come on, man, calm down. And so that's another conclusion. Another conclusion, as I said, black guys can get away with punching women, white women, black women, Hispanic women, not so much, but they can get away with punching white women if they can find a justification, and people will celebrate it because people hate Karens more than they hate violence against women. And this is a Karen, and they love violence against Karens. There doesn't even really need, even though this case, like, there's like some reason for it, they don't really need a justification for violence against white women. Hopefully white women watch these clips and realize, like, oh, these people we love, they can attack us with impunity. Hopefully they learn that lesson. And yeah, and I mean, those are the kind of the big things to take away from it, is the racial dynamics. And the final thing is, like, increasingly in public, I don't know if this is, women are taught that they can get away with like violent behavior and they don't have to suffer any consequences for it. And it is, even though this is a nasty scenario, and then there's like racial dynamics playing that allow this to occur without any real like condemnation is due to the racial dynamics. It's still like, women, you need to learn that you can't slap guys and throw drinks on them without like stuff happening. And like, if you do that, you are inviting violence upon yourself, and you really should watch your behavior because this can happen to you. But there has been a change because, there were several cases of college football players. There's like a change in the punching of women, white women, even if it's like they're like slapping them or whatever. That there are cases where there was like full on condemnation of these black football players like punching white women, and there's a couple cases in the mid 2010s. There was like a Florida State player. I'm pretty sure it was a Florida State player. I think it was like a quarterback or a running back. It wasn't Jameis Winston, I don't think. And this guy, Jameis Winston, had his own legal troubles, which I won't get into. This guy, like this fat white woman, was like aggressively harassing him at a bar for something, and she's like throwing a drink, and I think she was like getting in his face. And this guy just like punched her in the face, knocked her ass out. And if this had happened now, there would have been several media defenders of this person. But when it happened in the 2010s, everyone condemned this person. This guy was like kicked off his team, or he was like suspended. He suffered the consequences. He had criminal charges. There were no media defenders for him. And there was like a University of Missouri player who, I think this was one of the guys who boycotted the team during their this kind of precursor to Black Lives Matter uprising in 2015. This guy was in a cafeteria. He was like hitting on these white girls, and they rejected him. And then I think one of them shoved him away, and he like knocked her out in a cafeteria. And everyone condemned him and saw this as abhorrent behavior. But now people would defend them this is a post-Floyd world, and where really people in the propaganda and it's not just with like people on internet, it's people in real life. As you can see from the scenario that happened with the Steelers fans, and they all parted the waves and allowed this fight to occur. There's like several people around them, and then they all moved away when the fight happened. They didn't want to be involved, and it was likely due to it was like a black guy, and they just didn't want to get punched by him. And maybe they were worried that if they attacked a black guy, they may have a hate crime. But it's like something that was different, and you wouldn't have seen that scenario if it had been a white guy attacking a white woman. And there certainly wouldn't be Steelers' number one wide receiver praising the guy and saying that he did the right thing 5 years ago, or now if it had been a white guy. So that's one. So you can't ignore the racial dynamics here, even if the woman had invited the violence upon herself. Now, there's a perfect counterpoint to this scene that also occurred at a sports game. 7.5, well, it was almost 8 years ago now. It was in January 2014 at the Sugar Bowl game that was pitted the Oklahoma Sooners against the Alabama Crimson Tide. There was these Oklahoma frat guys who were being loud and obnoxious. Oklahoma went on to win the game, and I guess they were taunting Alabama fans, and there was this old middle-aged Alabama woman, maybe have been a mom of one of the Alabama players who was getting in their faces and like trying to like slap them and stuff. And these guys are just laughing and having a good time. And there's like, I guess, security or some type of people are trying to keep her away. And then she like slips by them and sneaks by them and like dives on them. And these guys, instead of reacting violently, they just laugh even more, even though this woman's like kicking one guy with her boots. And like that can do some serious damage. And these guys are just laughing and having a good time, and people are pulling her away, and she's like slapping and acting incredibly violent. And now all these guys could easily like really beat this woman like down to where she wouldn't have to worry about it. But they know they can't, and so the scenario is like they're treating it as like a funny oddity. It's like, wow, look at this crazy woman. Like this is just insane, but this is really funny. We'll find this entertaining. And that's probably the proper response to a lot of this behavior. Is that the black guy probably should have just laughed and like walked off instead of like punching her in the face. But that's not going to occur. And generally and also it's a completely different crowd you can see in this college football scenario. And now if any of those guys had like launched a punch at that woman, it immediately become the enemy. But in the whole story, it's like crazy woman, but people even still thought she was epic. It's like, wow, she does a WWE dive on her. And people thought it was epic. I looked up the story. I don't remember this from the time, but I was looking it up because I was looking at random fights, sports games fights from after, as a result of watching the video. And so I looked at this. And even if you look at the crowd, it's like a way classier crowd than the NFL game. These are all people in polos. They're all like nice looking white people. They're all like, even if these guys, like the OU frat guys are being obnoxious, they're probably still less obnoxious than the average NFL fan. And they're dressed way nicer. They look like much better people. And so is the rest of the crowd at this game. And everyone is looking at this woman like she's insane because she's violating bourgeois norms by like acting a fool, like acting like an idiot. And they're all just like staring at her. And this like shows like it's like a way. Now there's all problems with like a sports ball, with all sports ball events. But if you're going to go to a game, at least if you're going to a college football game, particularly like the SEC, there are problems with like of course college football, particularly the SEC. You're still going to be surrounded by nice white people, but at like NFL, you're surrounded by the trash who will get into a fight over like a spilled beer cup or something, and like so you'll have like 8 morbidly obese guys in cargo shorts and oversized jerseys surround you, and it's like, why did you enjoy the experience? And it's also, and like even comparing the diversity levels is like the entire crowd involved in this was 100% white. But if you look even at NFL stands, like it's there's a ton of diversity there. I made this point in my IQ supplement or not last week but 2 weeks ago about Woodstock 99, and if you look at the clip, this is wider than any major event you would see now, particularly with sporting events. If you go to an NFL game, you're going to see a lot of diversity. NBA game, you see a lot of diversity. The only place you're not going to see a lot of diversity is like a hockey game and college football game outside of the Pac-12. And it's like like it really does reaffirm the 2020 census report that whites are in decline. It's like you just don't see that many whites anymore. And like you can see whites, of course, but you don't see them as the overwhelming like majority of just like people. If you're just standing in a crowd, if you look to your left, you look to your right, you see pretty much all white people with like a few exceptions. You're not going to see that at an NFL game. And apparently at Woodstock 99, you wouldn't see that either. And the last places you can really see that is a college football game or a hockey game. And like at public events. I mean, maybe classical music concert, a few other, examples, but you're really not going to see anything that's attracting like over 10,000 people. Like probably not going to see that much or you're not going to see that much homogeneity. I probably messed up the pronunciation of that, but that's okay. You know what I'm saying. And so that's like probably the best way to conclude it. It's like tying it all back into the 2020 census with this scenario, with this Pittsburgh Steelers fight versus this, I don't even want to call it a fight, but this incident at the 2014 Sugar Bowl. So that's what the main takeaway was. So I'm gonna wrap up, but I want to say it wasn't quite an entire podcast episode, but it was a lengthy segment on it. And there's gonna be, as I always say with a lot of these events, you're probably gonna see more of these type of fight videos. They're gonna reveal a lot of the social dynamics and cultural trends in America from the NFL going forward, because this is just a preseason game. We haven't even gotten the regular season yet. I feel that there's going to be and this is like fans are finally returning. Like a lot of stadiums last year didn't really have fans, or they only allowed a certain number of fans. They are returning to regular capacity now. So, and there's something gone wrong with COVID where people are more violent and aggressive. And there was even way more fights at baseball games, which I never really even saw before, but there was like a ton of fight videos from and there's still, MLB season's still going on. So you've seen a ton of fight videos, and you're definitely going to see this. There's already been 2 viral fight videos in just the preseason. So we're going to see more. And I think there's going to be a bunch of others that are going to showcase modern American racial dynamics, and will give me a lot of material to talk on my podcast. So with that in mind, make sure to hit that like and subscribe button if you have not for Highly Respected's YouTube. And make sure, if you want to be really highly respected and really boost your IQ, to sign up for Highly Respected's IQ supplements at its Substack, and that is highly respected.substack.com. And until next time, stay respected.